When it comes to story selection, it's a good idea to explain your general approach to choosing stories and which stories you cover. That can become particularly important when it comes to crime, when it comes to politics, when it comes to elections. Now, it also may be important to explain for individual stories why you're choosing to cover them. If you're wondering when you should do that, some things to consider and some ways that might say that it's time to explain your story selection might be if you're covering something that you don't normally cover. If that's the case, then add an explanation as to why you're covering it. Maybe you're covering something differently. If you're covering something with 2 reporters or with 3 reporters, explain that to your users. Also, if you're covering something a lot more than you normally would, something like politics, maybe it's the election, or maybe it's the coronavirus coverage, that's another area, another time where it may make sense to explain why you're approaching your story coverage this way. Another red flag or something to think about when it comes to explaining story selection is if something has raised a lot of questions or a lot of discussion in the newsroom, or if people are unsure whether or not to cover it or split onto whether you should cover a story or how you should cover a story, that can also be a good clue that, hey, maybe we should explain our approach and why we're doing this to our users. Now that you've decided that a story needs an explanation or you want to share with your users why you're covering something, the question is how. One of the best ways that you can explain why you're choosing to cover something, or if you want to elaborate on the type of coverage you're giving a particular subject matter, or if you want to explain why maybe you're not covering certain elements of it, an explanation like an editor's note at the top of a story can go a long way. Make sure that that explanation includes the actual answer to the user's question of why you're covering that story. It's okay if you want to link to something that goes into this a little bit more, but part of that answer and part of that information should be there in the editor's note itself, and then someone can click if they want to read more about your decision making. This goes for on the top of a story. You also could add it to the bottom of the story or within the story. You also could add it to the beginning of an on-air intro or to the tag on a broadcast story. But remember, if you want them to know why you're covering something, catch their attention when you have it at the beginning and don't depend on them making it to the bottom of the article to find out why you're covering something. Other ways to talk about story selection can be when sharing it on social media. When you share the story, highlight with a couple sentences why you decided to cover the story and why it's important. When talking about story selection also and explaining why you chose to cover something, try to tie that back to your mission, your values as a news organization, and why this is important to the community and your commitment to serve the community. Another way to explain story selection could be in a newsletter. Newsletters are a great way to have more conversational tone with your users. And so you can use that to, when sharing that story, talk a little bit more about the conversations around covering it and your approach to covering that particular story. We all know that we have news values and that we have certain things that we're considering when choosing whether or not to cover a story. And if we're really realistic and honest with ourselves and with our users, sometimes that's related to resources. We either don't have enough or we don't have the right kind of resources to cover all of the stories that we want. There are so many news stories out there that we just can't cover everything. And so when you're talking about story selection and you're talking to your users about what you choose to cover or what you were unable to cover, don't be afraid to share that resources can be part of the decision-making process. Also talk about how staff is limited. Your resources are limited when it comes to a live truck or photographers or different reporters to go out in the field or the ability to travel. Talking about all of that can help them better understand what you're up against. And it's not complaining. It's just letting them in on the process and showing them that you are trying your best to cover the community in the best way that you can, but sometimes there are limited resources. And sometimes that means if someone calls in sick, a particular story maybe doesn't get done. Being honest can help them see that we are trying to be as good for the community as we can, and we're letting them see a little humility and that we can't do everything that we want, which I think can go a long way.